The garage on Maple Street had been there for 23 years, tucked between a corner deli and a laundromat that never seemed to close. Most people drove past without noticing the faded sign that read Pete's Auto Repair in letters that had once been red but now looked more like rust. The building itself wasn't much to look at: corrugated metal siding, oil stains on the concrete, and windows so grimy they barely let in light, but Pete Morrison kept the place running, and that was enough for the neighborhood. He arrived every morning at 6:30 sharp, before the coffee shops opened and long before most people thought about their broken-down cars. Pete was a man of routine. Same worn jeans, same blue work shirt with his name stitched in white thread above the pocket, same thermos of black coffee that he nursed throughout the day. He never played music while he worked, never had the radio on for background noise. Just the sound of tools against metal, the hiss of air compressors, and the occasional grunt when something fought back harder than expected. The customers who brought their cars to Pete's weren't looking for conversation. They came because he was good at what he did, because his prices were fair, and because he never tried to sell them repairs they didn't need. He'd nod when they dropped off their keys, tell them when to come back, and hand over an invoice that was always exactly what he'd quoted. No surprises, no small talk, no questions about their weekend plans. Some people found his silence unsettling. They'd try to fill the quiet with nervous chatter about the weather or complaints about traffic, but Pete would just keep working, his hands moving with practiced precision while his eyes stayed focused on whatever engine or transmission had earned his attention that day. After a while, most customers learned to leave him alone. Martha Chin had been bringing her Honda to Pete's for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to the neighborhood for her job at the hospital. She was an emergency room nurse, accustomed to chaos and comfortable with people who worked with their hands. Pete's quiet competence reminded her of the best surgeons she'd worked with, professionals who spoke through their actions rather than their words. That Tuesday morning in October, Martha dropped off her car for what she hoped would be a simple brake job. The grinding noise had been getting worse for weeks, and she couldn't put off the repair any longer. Pete had looked under the hood, pumped the brake pedal a few times, and nodded. "Pads and rotors," he'd said. "Have it ready by 4. Martha had planned to call a cab to get to work, but Pete mentioned that the parts delivery was running late. She could wait if she wanted, maybe an hour or 2. The hospital was understaffed anyway, and her shift didn't start until noon. She settled into the cracked plastic chair in the waiting area, a corner of the garage that Pete had grudgingly set up with a coffee maker and a stack of automotive magazines from the previous decade. The waiting area wasn't much, just that one chair, a small table covered in ring stains, and a view of Pete's workspace through a window that had been installed sometime in the 80s. Martha had sat there before, watching Pete work with the kind of focus that made complicated repairs look effortless. He moved around engines like a pianist around keys, never hesitating, never second-guessing himself, but this time, something caught her attention that she'd never noticed before. Behind Pete's main workbench, tucked between a shelf of oil filters and a pegboard hung with wrenches, was a small corkboard. It held the usual things you'd expect in a garage: parts receipts, a calendar from 2019, a business card from a hydraulic supply company. But wedged behind a clipboard, barely visible unless you were sitting at exactly the right angle, was the corner of what looked like an old photograph. Martha tried to focus on her magazine, an article about fuel efficiency in compact cars, but her eyes kept drifting back to that photograph. There was something about the way it was hidden, deliberately tucked away but not quite discarded, that made her curious. She'd always been good at reading people. It came with the nursing territory, and Pete Morrison had always struck her as a man carrying more than his share of secrets. The garage was quiet except for the steady rhythm of Pete working under the hood of a pickup truck. He'd been at it for 40 minutes, methodical and unhurried, occasionally reaching for a different tool or walking over to his parts cabinet. Martha watched him work, noting the way he moved with complete confidence despite never consulting a manual or diagram. 20 years of experience, she supposed, left its mark in ways that went deeper than memory. When Pete disappeared into the back office to take a phone call, Martha found herself standing up before she'd consciously decided to move. The photograph was calling to her, that barely visible corner that seemed to be hiding something significant. She walked over to the workbench, glancing toward the office door to make sure Pete was still occupied with his call. The corkboard was even messier up close, layers of papers and receipts creating an archaeological record of Pete's business. But the photograph was exactly where she'd spotted it from across the room, tucked behind everything else like it had been deliberately forgotten. Martha hesitated for a moment, then carefully moved the clipboard aside. What she saw made her breath catch. The photograph was old, probably from the 1990s based on the color saturation and the slightly faded quality that came from years of exposure to light. It showed a man in a flight suit standing beside what was unmistakably a military fighter jet. The aircraft was sleek, gray, with swept-back wings and a kind of aggressive profile that suggested serious speed and serious firepower. But it wasn't the jet that made Martha's heart skip, it was the man in the flight suit. 25 years younger, with darker hair and a clean-shaven face, but there was no mistaking Pete Morrison's eyes. The same calm, focused expression she'd seen him wear while diagnosing engine problems was staring back at her from the photograph, except instead of holding a wrench, he was holding a pilot's helmet, and on his chest, clearly visible against the dark fabric of his flight suit, was a mission patch unlike anything Martha had ever seen. It wasn't the standard military insignia she was familiar with from movies or documentaries. This patch was black with silver threading, featuring a design that looked both classified and dangerous, a bird of prey with wings spread over what appeared to be a map grid, surrounded by text too small to read in the photograph but clearly meaningful to those who needed to understand it. Martha stared at the image, her mind racing to reconcile the silent auto mechanic she knew with the fighter pilot in the photograph. Pete Morrison, who barely spoke 3 words during a typical customer interaction, who seemed to find all the communication he needed in the language of carburetors and brake lines, had once flown military aircraft in what looked like operations that probably didn't appear in any public records. She was so absorbed in the photograph that she didn't hear Pete's footsteps returning from the office. Didn't notice that his phone call had ended and he was walking back toward his workbench with a parts catalog in his hand. It wasn't until she heard the slight squeak of his work boots on the concrete floor that she realized she was no longer alone. Martha turned around to find Pete standing about 10 feet away, his eyes locked on the photograph in her hands. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence that had always been Pete's default mode seemed to take on a different quality, heavier and more charged than the comfortable quiet of concentrated work. Pete's expression was unreadable, but Martha noticed that his hands had gone very still. The parts catalog he'd been carrying was now pressed against his side like a shield, and his breathing had become more controlled, more deliberate. It was the posture of someone who had just realized that a carefully maintained secret was no longer secret. "I'm sorry," Martha said quietly, setting the photograph back where she'd found it. "I didn't mean to." Pete held up one hand, not aggressively but with enough authority to stop her mid-sentence. He walked over to the workbench, his movements more careful than usual, and looked down at the photograph without picking it up. For nearly a minute, the only sound in the garage was the distant hum of the air compressor cycling on and off. F-117 Nighthawk, Pete said finally, his voice so quiet that Martha had to lean forward to hear him. "Stealth fighter. Officially retired in 2008. Martha nodded, though she wasn't sure what response was appropriate. Pete was still staring at the photograph, and she had the sense that he was seeing much more than just an image of himself in a flight suit. He was looking at a different life, a different version of himself that he'd kept carefully hidden behind brake pads and oil changes. "You flew those?" Martha asked. Pete was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd heard her question. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a weight that she recognized from her work in the emergency room, the look of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen, who carried experiences that were too heavy to share but too important to forget. 12 years, he said. Mostly places that don't exist on maps. The simplicity of that statement somehow made it more profound than any detailed explanation could have been. Martha found herself thinking about all the times she'd watched Pete work, noting his precision and calm under pressure, qualities that she now realized had been honed in cockpits rather than garages. "That patch," she said, gesturing toward the photograph. "What does it mean?" Pete reached out and carefully turned the photograph face down, not hiding it but creating a boundary between past and present. "Some things are better left classified," he said. "Even after all these years." Martha understood. She'd worked with enough veterans over the years to recognize the particular silence that surrounded certain kinds of service. There were experiences that couldn't be translated into civilian language, operations that existed in the spaces between official history and personal memory. "Why cars?" she asked. "After flying fighters, why fix transmissions?" For the first time since she'd known him, Pete Morrison smiled. Not the polite, professional expression he wore when handing over invoices, but something genuine and slightly sad. "Engines are engines," he said. "Whether they're pushing you through the sky at Mach 1.5 or getting you to the grocery store. But cars don't shoot back." The weight of that statement settled between them. Martha thought about the steady stream of customers who brought their automotive problems to Pete, trusting him with their daily transportation needs, never knowing that the man adjusting their carburetors had once flown multimillion-dollar aircraft through hostile airspace on missions that would never be acknowledged by any government. "How long have you been here?" Martha asked. "Running the garage, I mean." "Bought the place in 2001, Pete said. 3 months after my last flight. Seemed like the right time to find something that stayed on the ground." Martha did the math quickly. 2001, that would have been shortly after September 11th, a time when military pilots were probably seeing increased deployment and heightened operational tempo. Pete had chosen to leave at a moment when his skills would have been more valuable than ever, trading the cockpit of a stealth fighter for the service bay of a neighborhood garage. "Do you miss it?" she asked. Pete was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently adjusting tools on his workbench with the kind of nervous precision that suggested deep thought. "Miss what? The flying or the missions?" "Both." "Either." "Flying, yes," he said. "Every day. There's nothing like being alone at 40,000 feet, pushing an aircraft that cost more than most people make in a lifetime." "The missions." He paused, glancing again at the turned-over photograph. "The missions I try not to think about." Martha nodded. She'd heard similar sentiments from combat veterans who ended up in her emergency room, men and women who could describe the technical aspects of their service with enthusiasm but grew quiet when the conversation turned to what they'd actually done during their deployments. "Your customers," she said. "Do any of them know?" Pete shook his head. "You're the first person to see that photograph in 20 years. Most people don't look past what they need to see. Broken car, trustworthy mechanic, fair price. Anything else is just background noise." That explained the careful anonymity Pete maintained, the way he'd structured his life to avoid the kind of attention that might lead to questions about his past. Martha wondered how many other mechanics, shop owners, and service workers were living similar double lives, carrying extraordinary histories while performing ordinary jobs. "The Air Force," she said. "Do they know where you are?" "They know," Pete said. "But pilots who flew certain aircraft on certain missions, we have an understanding. We keep quiet about what we did, and they keep quiet about where we ended up. Works out better for everyone." The phone in Pete's office rang, interrupting their conversation. He glanced toward the sound but didn't move to answer it. "Probably another parts supplier," he said. "They can call back." Martha realized that she was witnessing something rare, Pete Morrison engaging in actual conversation, sharing pieces of a story that he'd kept locked away for decades. She felt honored and slightly overwhelmed by the trust he was placing in her. "That patch in the photograph," she said. "Was it for a specific operation?" Pete looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth their unexpected conversation could bear. "Kosovo," he said finally. 1999, officially, stealth fighters were used for precision strikes against strategic targets. Unofficially. He trailed off, shaking his head. "Unofficially?" "Unofficially, some of us flew missions that required a level of deniability that even stealth technology couldn't provide, the kind of operations where aircraft serial numbers were temporarily reassigned and flight logs were classified at levels that don't have names." Martha felt a chill run down her spine. She was getting a glimpse into a world that existed parallel to the official narrative of military operations, a shadow version of history where pilots like Pete carried out missions that would never be acknowledged or celebrated. "How many people knew about those flights?" she asked. "In my squadron? Maybe 8 pilots total. In the Air Force? Maybe a dozen officers with the clearance to know we existed. In the government?" Pete shrugged. "Probably fewer than 50 people, and half of them are dead now." The casual way he mentioned death made Martha realize that Pete's service had been more dangerous than even classified missions typically were. These weren't just secret operations, they were suicide missions disguised as strategic strikes, flown by pilots who understood that their survival was secondary to their mission success. "Why are you telling me this?" Martha asked. Pete was quiet for a moment, his hands now completely still as he considered her question. "Because you looked," he said finally. "Most people see what they expect to see and nothing more. But you looked close enough to notice something that didn't fit, and you asked questions instead of just walking away." Martha understood. Pete had spent 20 years hiding in plain sight, protected by the comfortable anonymity of a neighborhood auto mechanic. But her curiosity had breached that protection, and now he was faced with a choice: lie to maintain his cover or trust her with the truth. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you know that the man who fixes your brakes used to fly fighter jets on missions that officially never happened," Pete said. "What you do with that information is up to you." Martha thought about that responsibility. She could walk out of the garage and never mention what she'd learned, allowing Pete to maintain the quiet life he'd built for himself. Or she could ask more questions, push for details about operations that were probably still classified, potentially putting him at risk of unwanted attention from people who preferred that certain stories remain untold. "Your secret is safe with me," she said. Pete nodded, not with surprise but with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose judgment about people had been validated. "I figured it would be. Nurses know how to keep confidential information confidential. But can I ask one more question?" "Depends on the question. Do you ever think about going back? Flying again, I mean. Civilian aircraft, maybe." Pete was quiet for a long time, his gaze drifting toward the photograph that was still face down on his workbench. "I've thought about it," he said. "But civilian flying wouldn't be the same. When you've flown aircraft that can disappear from radar and deliver precision strikes in complete darkness, private planes feel like toys." Martha understood. Pete had operated at the absolute pinnacle of aviation technology, flying missions that pushed both man and machine to their limits. Anything else would feel like a step backward. "Besides," Pete continued, "there's something to be said for work that doesn't involve life and death decisions every few minutes. Cars break down, I fix them, people drive away happy. Nobody gets shot at, nobody has to worry about surface-to-air missiles, and at the end of the day, I go home instead of filing classified debriefings." The phone in the office rang again, and this time Pete moved toward it. "I should take that," he said. "Probably your brake parts arriving." As Pete disappeared into the office, Martha looked around the garage with new eyes. The organized tool displays, the methodical arrangement of parts and supplies, the attention to detail that she'd always attributed to professional pride, all of it took on new meaning when viewed as the habits of someone trained for precision in much more demanding circumstances. When Pete returned, he was carrying a small cardboard box and wearing his usual expression of professional competence. The moment of shared confidence was over, and he was back to being the neighborhood mechanic who spoke primarily through his work. "Parts are here," he said. "Give me another hour and you'll be ready to go." Martha nodded and returned to her chair in the waiting area. But as she watched Pete begin work on her brake system, she found herself seeing things differently. The way he moved around her car with complete spatial awareness, never turning his back on the garage entrance. The way his eyes regularly swept the workspace, checking for changes or anomalies. The way he worked with both hands free, keeping his movements efficient and ready to respond to unexpected situations. These weren't the habits of an auto mechanic. These were the instincts of someone trained for combat operations, someone who had learned to maintain situational awareness even while performing routine tasks. Pete Morrison might have traded his flight suit for work clothes, but he was still thinking like a fighter pilot. An hour later, Pete emerged from under Martha's car, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "All set," he said, handing her the keys and a handwritten invoice. "Brakes should be good for another 60,000 miles." Martha paid the bill and prepared to leave, but as she reached the door, she turned back. "Pete," she said. "Thank you for trusting me with your story." Pete looked up from cleaning his tools. For a moment, his expression softened, and Martha caught a glimpse of the man behind the carefully maintained facade. "Thank you for asking the right questions," he said. As Martha drove away, her newly repaired brakes responding smoothly to her touch, she thought about the extraordinary ordinariness of Pete Morrison's life. A man who had once flown the most advanced military aircraft in the world was now content to spend his days ensuring that neighborhood cars ran reliably. It seemed like such a dramatic step down, but maybe that was exactly the point. Maybe after years of operating in the shadows of international conflict, there was something deeply satisfying about work that was transparent and straightforward. Maybe after flying missions where success was measured in targets destroyed and enemies neutralized, there was peace in measuring success by the satisfied customers who drove away with functioning vehicles. That evening, Martha found herself researching F-117 Nighthawk operations during the Kosovo conflict. The official records were sparse, focusing mainly on the aircraft's technological capabilities and its role in establishing air superiority. But between the lines of sanitized military press releases, she could sense the presence of operations that had never been fully disclosed, the shadow missions that Pete had alluded to during their conversation. She learned that the F-117 had been retired earlier than originally planned, officially due to budget constraints and the development of more advanced stealth technology. But Martha wondered if there were other reasons, if aircraft like the one Pete had flown had become too associated with operations that needed to be forgotten rather than celebrated. Over the following weeks, Martha found herself paying more attention to the people around her, wondering how many carried similar secrets behind their everyday facades. The postal worker who delivered her mail with military precision. The grocery store manager who seemed to have an unusual awareness of store security. The night shift nurse at the hospital who never spoke about her previous career but moved with the confidence of someone trained for much more demanding situations. Pete Morrison had opened her eyes to the possibility that extraordinary stories were hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by the comfortable anonymity of ordinary jobs and routine responsibilities. People who had once operated in worlds of classified missions and national security concerns, now content to find meaning in simpler, more transparent forms of service. When Martha brought her car back to Pete's garage 6 months later for routine maintenance, their interaction was professional and brief. Pete performed his inspection, recommended an oil change and tire rotation, and completed the work with his usual efficiency. But when he handed her the invoice, Martha noticed something different. Tucked behind her receipt was a small piece of paper with an address written in Pete's careful handwriting. Below the address was a single line, Air and Space Museum. "They have one on display now. Thought you might want to see it." Martha looked up, but Pete was already focused on his next customer's vehicle, his attention completely absorbed by a transmission problem that required his expertise. She pocketed the paper and left without saying anything, understanding that this was Pete's way of sharing one more piece of his story without compromising the quiet life he'd built for himself. The following weekend, Martha drove to the museum and found the F-117 Nighthawk displayed in a place of honor among other retired military aircraft. The placard described its service record in general terms, mentioning its role in several conflicts but focusing mainly on its technological innovations. Nothing about shadow missions or classified operations, nothing about the pilots who had flown aircraft like this one into hostile territory on missions that officially never happened. But as Martha stood looking at the sleek, angular aircraft, she thought about Pete Morrison working in his garage, using skills honed in one of the most demanding flying environments ever created to ensure that neighborhood cars ran smoothly and safely. It was a strange kind of poetry, the way extraordinary training could find new purpose in ordinary tasks. She stayed at the museum for over an hour, walking around the aircraft and trying to imagine what it would have been like to fly such a machine into combat. The cockpit was so small, the instruments so complex, the entire aircraft so clearly designed for one purpose, to penetrate enemy airspace undetected and accomplish missions that conventional aircraft couldn't survive. When Martha finally left the museum, she understood something new about Pete Morrison and people like him. They weren't hiding from their past, they were protecting it. By maintaining their anonymity, by choosing ordinary work over the recognition their service might have earned them, they were preserving something valuable about their experiences while building new lives that didn't depend on past accomplishments. Pete Morrison would continue fixing cars on Maple Street, and most of his customers would continue seeing only what they needed to see: a competent mechanic who charged fair prices and did reliable work. But for those few who looked closely enough to notice the details that didn't quite fit, who asked the right questions and earned his trust, Pete's story would continue to reveal itself in small, carefully measured doses, and Martha Chen would carry that story with her, a reminder that extraordinary courage and skill often chose to hide behind the most ordinary facades, finding new ways to serve in a world that had moved beyond the need for stealth fighters and classified missions. The photograph remained tucked behind Pete's clipboard, a small reminder of who he used to be, carefully hidden but never forgotten. Just like the man himself, still serving, still making a difference, just in ways that would never appear in any official records or mission reports. Some stories, Martha realized, were too important to be told publicly. They belonged to the quiet spaces between official history and personal memory, carried by people who understood that the most meaningful service often happened without recognition or fanfare. Pete Morrison knew that better than most.